welcome back. And so now we're going to look at how our limitations, the human limitation, creates some of these needs. What we're talking about is something called acuity. There are a couple of types of acuity that we're going to look at here, how they influence our thinking when we are making a map. When we design our maps, design the symbols to use, when we think about what information that we can get from a map as well. So let's not forget that it's not just us designing a map, we also read maps. We are users, we gather data from maps, we digitize them, for example. What limitations are there embedded in this map, in this data source that I have? What has the cartographer who created this map had to do in order to produce it? What did they have to think about? So that all of those generalization methods were previously applied by another cartographer when you yourself get hold of a map and need to use it for your own purposes. So let's examine what are the problems. Well, what is it that's behind this? Well, we have eyes, and our eyes are sensitive to light, but they have a limitation. You know, how small an object can we actually see? And this is so if we look at the visibility acuity, it tells us what's the smallest thing that we can see on a map, the smallest point or line. We can see a black line or a black point on a white background, for example. This changes somewhat with colour, depending on which colours are being used. If we've got black on yellow, it's even more distinct than black on white. But generally speaking, this is going to be using the black on white idea, and the variations on that, obviously. But if we regard the distance of a reading distance of a map, according to Dent in cartography, thematic map design, the typical reading distance would be 46 centimeters. Well, I think he gives it in inches, but so 46 centimeters is standard distance that you can consider as where you would hold the map to read. And that will vary from person to person, obviously, and depending on how old you are, and your eyesight. The older you get, the shorter your arms are. They're never long enough to see the damn thing. So this will obviously vary, but as a rule of thumb, this is what we're going to be working on. This is what the cartographer thinks of when making the map. What other cartographers have thought of when they made their maps, and what you should consider when you make yours as well. So if we say that at a distance of 46 centimeters, which is our reading distance, typically the human eye will be able to see something as small as 0.15 millimeters. That's quite small. That's a minimum that we can have for line thickness, for example. We don't really want to go below that because it becomes very difficult to perceive things. Point symbols as well, that might even be a little too small for a point symbol. You know, we've got these things to work with when we're using like a patterning, for example, which we'll come to in the next slide as well, actually. The points need to be big enough to be seen, and also to convey some useful information. We need to be able to see what type of point it is. Not just see that there is a point, but that is a point symbol representing something. So we need to be quite careful of how small these things can be. But that's, generally speaking, the smallest thing we're going to be able to see, 0.15 millimeters at reading distance. Obviously, if we can pull the paper in closer and we've got young enough eyes, or if you're short-sighted so you can actually see when things are that close, you can see a smaller thing. Otherwise, not. So that's the visibility acuities, the smallest thing you can see. We also have the resolution acuity, which how far apart do things need to be for us to be able to distinguish them? This is generally speaking regarded as being more similar to this concept we looked at in a previous course with the Nyquist rate, where the sampling distance, how far between samples of the ground or whatever it is we're examining, and what's the spacing of those before we lose information. So if we look at this from a cartographic point of view, how far apart do, say, dots need to be, points? If this is a patterning on a symbol, or we have point symbols representing something like we have with our houses dotted along a road, when are they too close together so that you can't quite see them and they just sort of blur into each other, as we've got with these points here. And these lines, we can see they become more and more distinct. This is actually a bigger distance. This is, oddly enough, we need to the separation between these things for them to be visible, for that separation to be clear, is actually 0.76 millimeters according to Dent. Again, there's going to be some variation, and if we look at, say, the size of the objects that are being separated as well, this will influence things. So this first step here, all I've done is made the points smaller. The distance from their centres then suddenly becomes much larger, so the gap is much larger. But then when we start looking at these smaller objects, the distance between them, it's kind of relative. We can see that they go together, but they do look like one object, but the distance between them is exactly the same as the distance between those, yet they seem perhaps more distinct. And again, with the lines, the thicker and thicker the lines become, is the distance correct? The spacing, do they appear to become one thing? So this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and has been addressed by other cartographers. The spacing between the objects so that you can distinguish one from another, rather than just going into one thing, becoming one object. So how does this then relate to our maps when we can see these things? What is important here? What do we need to consider, given that this is a GIS course as well? What is of interest here when we look at this acuity problem? So what's the smallest object that can be shown? This depends on the scale. So if we remember, scale follows this simple formula. The scale times the size of an object on paper is equal to the size it is on the ground, in reality, as it were. So if we use that, the smallest object in a 1 to 50,000 map, here's our scale, 50,000. If we multiply that with the smallest object we said that you could represent on a map, if we really push things to the extreme, 0.15 millimeters. So if we do that, quick calculation, 7.5 meters in a 1 to 50,000 map, which is a standard map, nothing smaller than 7.5 meters is going to be seen, and that's a tiny point. 7.5 meters, that's basically the size of a house. It's a fairly small house perhaps, but that's still a very, very small symbol as well. So that's not a small object that suddenly disappears if we go smaller than that on the map. And the smallest gap, well, because this was actually, we needed an even larger gap, we're looking at 38 meters. If we take this value of 0.76 millimeters as correct, as true, for being able to distinguish one object from another on a map, at this scale of 50,000, you need what will be on the ground 38 meters between points, which explains again why we have houses moving away from the road, why we need to move the road away from the houses when we represent things on a map. The houses and the road, because generally speaking, houses aren't that far away from the road. They're a lot closer to it, but we wouldn't be able to see the symbol. They just go into each other and look quite ugly. And that's if they were, if we have colour maps, sure, we can use the colour distinction to help that, but then we've got this ugliness of one symbol laying over another, and that tends to be avoided. So we need to consider these things when we interpret other people's maps. When we look at the data that's in there, what actually can we see? What is the smallest pixel size that we can use when we digitize a map, for example? Or what's meaningful, at least, because we have these limitations in our data. And all of this, as we can see, we can look at these different elements and say, well, where do these come in? We can see where things start to get blurry. Why do we need to just abandon these and turn them into one larger object? Because they're going to just move into each other and create this mess. Or perhaps we can simply remove some of the points and space them out a bit so that we, this smallest gap We can create the smallest gap by just getting rid of some houses and the displacement tissue again. So all of this is these two are the acuity is the basic cause in many respects of the need for generalization. It's not just a data issue on the computer. That we've probably already taken care of when we did that initial step. Remember the first slides we looked at when we conceptualized the world. We've probably done a good job of taking care of that bit. Maybe not. It depends on what's happening with the data later on. This is more about how we can visualize the data on the screen, on the map, how we can talk to the user, the reader, and how you are being treated as the reader when you gather data yourself. This is Acuity.